The cold woke me first, seeping through the thin fabric of my uniform and into my bones with the patient hunger of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. I opened my eyes to darkness so complete it felt textured, granular, pressing against my face like a physical substance. Somewhere in that darkness, water dripped with metronomic regularity, each drop a small detonation in the silence that made my jaw clench reflexively. I tried to move and discovered that my left arm would not respond, that the numbness extending from shoulder to fingertip was not the temporary paralysis of poor circulation, but something deeper, something that tasted of copper and chemical preservatives. When I finally managed to turn my head enough to see the crude surgical staples holding new flesh to old bone, they had rebuilt me while I slept or while I was dead. I no longer knew which, no longer understood where the boundary between those states existed. The last clear memory I possessed was the artillery strike. The way the bunker's ceiling had come down in sections, each collapse accompanied by screams that ended with wet finality. I had been 2nd Logistics Officer for the 47th Infantry Regiment, assigned to a forward supply depot on a contested world, whose name I had never learned, because names were reserved for places that mattered, and this planet mattered only as a coordinate on a map, a point where supply lines intersected and men died in quantities sufficient to require constant replacement. My job had been inventory management, ensuring that ammunition and rations reached the front lines in quantities that matched projected casualty rates, a mathematics of death that I had performed, with the detached efficiency of someone who believed that numbers could insulate him from the reality they represented. The artillery strike had taught me the inadequacy of that belief. I remembered the first shells landing, remembered the way the air itself seemed to compress and then explode. Outward, remembered Private Kellick's body coming apart in a spray of meat and fabric that painted the wall beside me in colors I had no names for. I remembered the ceiling falling, remembered the weight of concrete and steel driving me into the floor, remembered the darkness that followed, and the certainty that I was dying, that this was how my service ended, crushed beneath the debris of a forgotten war on a world that would not remember my name. But I had not died. I had woken instead in this darkness with flesh that was not entirely mine grafted to bones that remembered breaking, and somewhere beyond the range of my hearing a voice was saying that I was alive, which meant I was still needed, which meant that death was not a release the Empire granted to those who retained utility. The cold intensified as consciousness solidified, became less a sensation and more a state of being, as if temperature was something that happened inside me rather than around me. I tried again to move, managed to shift my weight enough to roll onto my right side, my functional side, and felt something beneath me crack and give way. Not bone. The sound was wrong for bone, too brittle, too sharp, but something organic that had been frozen and was now breaking under pressure. I did not want to know what I was lying on, did not want to examine the substance coating the floor in a layer thick enough to cushion and crack, but ignorance was not a luxury I would be permitted for long. Light arrived without warning, a sudden assault of yellowish illumination from panels in the ceiling that flickered and stabilized, and revealed the room in all its functional horror. I was in what had once been a medical bay, could recognize the architectural bones of it beneath the modifications and decay. Surgical tables lined the walls, most of them occupied by shapes that might once have been human, that retained enough human characteristics to make their deviation from humanity more disturbing than complete. Alienness would have been. The floor was indeed covered in a layer of frozen biological matter, condensation from bodies kept in chemical preservation, mixed with fluids that had leaked and frozen and accumulated over what must have been months or years. My new arm was crude work, obviously temporary, the kind of emergency attachment performed when speed mattered more than aesthetics or long-term viability. The flesh was several shades paler than my original skin, the muscle structure visible through dermis that was too thin, too translucent, like something grown in haste and attached before it had finished developing. The fingers moved when I concentrated, but the movement was sluggish, imprecise, accompanied by small cracking sounds as if the joints contained ice that needed to break before motion was possible. A door opened at the far end of the room, the sound of it so loud after the silence that I flinched and felt something tear in my new shoulder, felt warm fluid begin to leak down my ribs. The figure that entered was human in the technical sense, possessed the correct number of limbs and the approximate proportions, but moved with a jerking asymmetry that suggested extensive augmentation poorly integrated with remaining biological systems. It wore the grey robes of a medicae, though the fabric was stained with substances that ranged from rust brown to chemical green, and its face was hidden behind a rebreather mask that hissed with each exhalation. "You're awake," it said, voice rendered mechanical and flat by the mask's filters. "Good, we have work." I tried to speak, managed only a sound like something caught in a trap, my throat raw and uncooperative. The medicae moved closer, its steps leaving prints in the frozen slurry on the floor, and I saw that its hands were wrong. Too many fingers or too few, the proportions suggesting multiple surgical revisions that had never quite achieved their intended configuration. "Don't try to talk yet. The reconstructive work on your throat is incomplete. Shrapnel damage, extensive tissue loss, vocal cords replaced with synthetic alternatives that require calibration." It produced a data slate from its robes, consulted it with the perfunctory attention of someone reviewing a maintenance checklist. "You are Officer Designate Vaughn, former 2nd Logistics Officer, 47th Infantry Regiment. Your unit was destroyed 14 weeks ago during enemy bombardment of Supply Depot Tertius 7. Casualty rate, 100%. Survival rate, 0.03%. You, 14 weeks. I had been dead, or something close to dead, for 14 weeks. The mathematics were impossible to process, the gap between memory and present too vast to bridge with anything resembling continuity. What had they done to me during those weeks? What necessities had required keeping me in preservation rather than granting the mercy of burial or cremation? "You were selected for reclamation," the medicae continued, as if reading my thoughts, though more likely it was simply following a script it had delivered countless times before. Cerebral functions tested within acceptable parameters. Cognitive capacity sufficient for continued administrative service. Physical damage extensive but not prohibitive. You meet the criteria for medical reconstruction and return to duty. The criteria. There were always criteria, always metrics that determined whether a human being constituted a repairable asset or disposable waste. I had spent years implementing those criteria, processing casualty reports and replacement requisitions, calculating the point at which it became more efficient to requisition a new soldier than to repair a damaged one. The irony of finding myself subject to those same calculations would have been amusing if I possessed the capacity for amusement, if the cold had not driven everything except the baseline instinct for survival into some deep hibernation. "Stand," the medicae ordered, and when I did not immediately comply, could not immediately comply, my muscles still remembering their dissolution beneath concrete and steel, it grasped my new arm with its malformed hand and pulled. The pain was extraordinary, not the sharp clarity of a wound, but the deep systemic agony of tissue that had not finished integrating, that was being asked to bear weight before the grafts had fully taken. I screamed, or tried to scream, but my reconstructed throat produced only a wet clicking sound, and the medicae continued pulling with mechanical indifference until I was upright, swaying, my vision fragmenting into black spots that expanded and contracted like living things. Mobility acceptable, it noted, updating its data slate. Proceed to orientation chamber for duty briefing and equipment assignment. It released me and I nearly fell, caught myself against one of the surgical tables and felt the cold metal against my palm, felt the responding numbness that spread up my functional arm as if cold was contagious, as if it could migrate from surface to surface seeking warmth to extinguish. The shape on the table beside me had been human once, was perhaps still technically human, though its chest had been opened and various organs removed or rearranged according to some logic I could not fathom. Its eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that suggested it had been conscious during the procedures, that it had watched its own vivisection with the helpless awareness of a specimen in a laboratory. I looked away, tried to focus on the simple mechanics of standing, of balancing on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, borrowed limbs that I was operating through some remote interface rather than direct neural control. The Medicae was already moving toward the door, expecting me to follow, confident that I would follow because where else was there to go, what else was there to do, except comply with the momentum of my own utility. The corridor beyond the medical bay was narrow and low-ceilinged, the walls sweating condensation that had frozen in long vertical streaks, creating a texture like fossilized tears. Emergency lighting provided irregular illumination, panels that flickered or had failed entirely, leaving sections of near-total darkness between islands of sickly yellow light. The cold was worse here, aggressive, the kind of cold that made breathing painful, that turned exhalation into visible clouds that hung in the air like small ghosts before dissipating. We passed other figures in the corridors, most of them moving with the same jerking imprecision as the Medicae, bodies that had been repaired or augmented, past the point where natural movement remained possible. Some were missing limbs, the stumps capped with crude prosthetics, or simply left open, the bone and muscle visible beneath translucent preservation membranes. Others had been augmented with additional limbs, extra arms sprouting from shoulder blades or rib cages, serving functions I could not immediately identify. None of them looked at me, none acknowledged my presence, and I understood that I had joined a population for whom individual identity had become subordinate to collective function, where recognition and acknowledgement were inefficiencies that diverted resources from primary objectives. The orientation chamber was a lecture hall that had been stripped of its seating, leaving only the bare floor and a lectern at the front where another robed figure stood waiting. This one was more extensively augmented than the Medicae, its head encased in a metal shell from which various sensors and input devices protruded, its body hidden beneath robes that could not quite conceal the mechanical components supporting its weight. When it spoke, its voice emerged from a vox grill in its chest, each word preceded by a fractional delay as organic thought was translated into mechanical speech. Officer Designate Von, you have been reclaimed for continued service in support of the Emperor's war effort. Your previous assignment as logistics officer has been reviewed and found suitable for continuation with modifications necessitated by your current physical status and the strategic requirements of this facility. You will be assigned to Inventory Management Division, subsection Gamma, where you will oversee the processing and distribution of biological materials required for ongoing medical reconstruction operations. Biological materials. The euphemism was almost charming in its inadequacy, its assumption that language could soften the reality it described. I understood immediately what biological materials meant in this context. Understood that the shapes on those surgical tables, the figures moving through the corridors with their borrowed flesh and jury-rigged augmentations, were both the products and the raw materials of this facility's operations. This was a reclamation center, a place where the nearly dead were rendered down and rebuilt, where the boundaries between patient and parts inventory had been deliberately obscured to maximize resource utilization. "You will report to your assigned station in 30 minutes, the augmented officer continued. "Failure to report constitutes dereliction of duty and will result in immediate reassignment to non-cognitive service roles. Your quarters have been prepared. Your equipment has been issued. You are alive, which means you are still needed. Dismissed." The phrase landed like a physical blow, not because it was cruel. Cruelty required intention, required some awareness of the suffering it inflicted, but because it was simply true, stated with the neutral finality of mathematical proof. I was alive, which meant I retained utility, which meant I was obligated to continue serving until utility was exhausted or my physical structure failed beyond the capacity of repair. Death was not an ending here but a state change, a transition from one form of service to another, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that there was no escape from this place, except through deterioration so complete that even the most desperate reclamation efforts could not extract further value. The quarters I was assigned consisted of a cell perhaps 2 meters square, containing a sleeping platform and a small shelf for personal effects I did not possess. The walls were the same sweating metal as the corridors, cold radiating from them in waves that made the space feel smaller than its physical dimensions. There was no door, only an opening covered by a thin plastic curtain that provided the illusion of privacy without the substance. I could hear through the walls the sounds of other occupants in adjacent cells, wet coughing, the whir of malfunctioning augmetics, voices muttering prayers or curses, or simply cycling through administrative codes and inventory numbers, minds seeking comfort in familiar patterns. I sat on the sleeping platform and examined my new arm in the dim light filtering through the curtain. The surgical work was deteriorating already, the thin skin beginning to split at the graft points, revealing the discolored muscle beneath. Infection was inevitable with work this crude, performed in conditions this unsanitary, but infection was a problem for later, for the next reclamation cycle when this arm would fail and require replacement with another harvested from another nearly dead soldier brought to this facility for processing. The equipment they had issued me consisted of a data slate, a stylus, and a small badge indicating my rank and clearance level. The badge was corroded, obviously recycled, the name of its previous owner still partially visible beneath the new designation they had stamped over it. I wondered what had happened to that previous owner, whether they had been promoted or deteriorated past the point of viability, whether their component parts were now distributed across multiple recipients or had been rendered down into the chemical slurries used for rapid tissue synthesis. I reported to my assigned station as ordered, found it to be a small office carved from what had once been a storage room, the walls still bearing the painted numbers and symbols indicating its previous purpose. A desk, a chair, a terminal connected to the facility's inventory management system. The terminal displayed a constant stream of data, requisitions for specific tissue types, notifications of new arrivals whose organs and limbs were being assessed for suitability, updates on ongoing surgical procedures and the materials they consumed. My job was to maintain balance between supply and demand, to ensure that the biological materials required for reconstruction were available in quantities sufficient to meet operational tempo, to flag shortages and suggest alternatives when primary resources were depleted. It was exactly the work I had done before, the same mathematics of death and resource allocation, except now I was working with the constituent parts of human beings rather than the equipment that killed them. The terminal listed tissue types, with the same clinical precision I had once applied to ammunition calibers: muscle tissue, category B, subtype 7, quantity available, quantity required, projected consumption rate. Organ systems: cardiovascular, neurological, respiratory, each broken down into component parts that could be harvested and transplanted according to compatibility matrices and urgency assessments. I began processing the requisitions, my fingers moving across the input device with mechanical efficiency, approving transfers and flagging shortages with the automatic precision of someone whose cognitive functions had been reduced to pattern recognition and data entry. The work required no thought, no engagement beyond the most superficial level, which was perhaps its mercy, the only mercy this place offered, the opportunity to retreat into routine, to let procedure insulate consciousness from reality. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, in a facility where day and night were meaningless categories, where time was measured only in shift changes and surgical schedules. The cold remained constant, inescapable, my new arm growing progressively more numb as circulation failed in tissues that had never been properly integrated with my vascular system. I watched the skin split further, watched clear fluid begin to leak from the widening gaps, and understood that this arm had perhaps another week of functionality before it would need replacement, before I would wake on one of those surgical tables while some medic grafted fresh tissue to my deteriorating stump. A requisition appeared on my screen that made me pause, that penetrated the protective fog of routine with its specific horror. Request for cerebral tissue, frontal lobe, mass approximately 40 grams, purpose, cognitive enhancement for officer-grade recipient, currently undergoing neural reconstruction. Deliver to Surgical Theatre 7 within 2 hours. Someone was having pieces of brain transplanted into their skull, was receiving cognitive enhancement through the grafting of tissue harvested from another human being whose frontal lobe had been deemed surplus to requirements. The procedure was not unknown. I had read medical briefings describing experimental treatments for cognitive damage, techniques that involved supplementing damaged neural tissue with material harvested from compatible donors. But reading about a procedure and seeing the requisition appear on your screen, knowing that you were responsible for ensuring its completion, were entirely different experiences. I processed the requisition, flagged it as urgent, and watched the system automatically identify a suitable donor from current inventory. The donor's designation appeared on my screen: subject 4719, male, age 24, current status, minimal cognitive function following traumatic head injury, prognosis, negative, recommended for resource reclamation. He was alive in the technical sense, maintained on life support, while various committees debated whether his cognitive capacity might recover to useful levels, and the system had determined that the answer was no, that his most valuable contribution would be as component parts for others whose damage was less severe. I authorized the extraction, signed my designation to the order, and felt nothing, or felt so much that it collapsed into numbness, into the same emotional void I had occupied since waking in that medical bay. The mathematics were sound. One life with minimal function could be distributed across multiple lives with greater capacity for service. The Empire's resources were finite, its needs infinite, and efficiency demanded that we extract maximum utility from every asset regardless of squeamishness or outdated ethical frameworks that prioritized individual preservation over collective benefit. The terminal chimed, indicating a message from Facility Command. I opened it and read the brief text. Officer Designate Vaughn, your performance has been noted. Continue current duties. Your next medical review is scheduled in 5 days. Prepare for assessment of graft integration and potential augmentation requirements. augmentation requirements. The phrase suggested that my current reconstruction was only the beginning, that they had plans for additional modifications, improvements that would enhance my utility at the cost of whatever remained of my original physical structure. I thought about the augmented figures I had seen in the corridors, their bodies more machine than flesh, their movements governed by systems that overrode biological impulses with programmed efficiency. I thought about becoming one of them, about the incremental transformation from damaged human to optimized tool, each medical review stripping away another layer of organic limitation until what remained was so far removed from my original form that identity became a purely administrative designation, a name attached to a collection of parts that had forgotten they had ever been anything else. The shift ended, or I assumed it ended based on the change in the facility's ambient noise, the increase in corridor traffic as one group of workers replaced another in the perpetual cycle of operation that never fully ceased. I returned to my cell, lay on the sleeping platform, and tried to sleep despite the cold, despite the pain radiating from my deteriorating arm, despite the knowledge of what tomorrow would bring, and the day after, an endless succession of requisitions and extractions and reconstructions, mathematics of suffering implemented with bureaucratic precision. Sleep, when it finally came, was populated with dreams that were less narrative than sensation, less story than texture. I dreamed of cold that had weight and substance, that pressed down on me like earth filling a grave. I dreamed of my body coming apart in sections, each piece catalogued and stored for future use, my consciousness distributed across multiple hosts, like data backed up across redundant systems. I dreamed of the artillery strike, but in the dream the shells landed with surgical precision, each explosion removing exactly the components that this facility would later require, my body being prepared for reclamation even as it was destroyed. I woke to the same darkness, the same cold, the same wet clicking sound of my reconstructed throat, attempting to clear itself of accumulated fluid. My new arm was worse, the skin completely split along most of the graft seam, the muscle beneath turning dark as blood flow failed and tissue began to necrotize. I would need to report to medical before my next shift, would need to have the arm assessed and probably replaced, another surgery, another period of recovery that would be measured in hours rather than days, because the facility's needs could not accommodate extended convalescence. The medical bay was crowded when I arrived, filled with figures in various states of reconstruction, waiting their turn for assessment and repair. I took a place in the queue, stood swaying slightly as the numbness in my arm spread up into my shoulder and across my chest, and watched the Medicae move from patient to patient with efficient indifference, their diagnoses delivered in the same flat mechanical voices, their treatments implemented with the speed of assembly line workers maintaining machinery. When my turn came, the Medicae, a different one than before, or perhaps the same one, they were difficult to distinguish beneath their masks and augmentations, examined my arm with quick competence, prodding the necrotizing tissue with instruments that generated small readings on a handheld scanner. Graft failure, accelerated necrosis, septic contamination spreading to regional lymphatics, it announced to no one in particular, its voice suggesting neither surprise nor concern, merely noting facts as they appeared. Recommended treatment, surgical removal of failed graft, aggressive debridement of infected tissue, replacement with compatible donor tissue from current inventory. Schedule immediate. The procedure will take approximately 40 minutes. You will return to duty upon completion. No anesthetic was mentioned, no pain management protocol, and I understood that consciousness during surgery was not an oversight, but a requirement, that they needed me awake to confirm nerve integration, to verify motor control, to participate in the calibration of new tissue to old nervous system. I was led to a surgical table, still occupied by its previous patient, who was being moved by orderlies whose own bodies showed signs of repeated reconstruction. I lay down on a surface still warm from its last occupant, felt the residual heat against my back like a ghost of life, and watched the Medicae arrange its instruments with the practiced precision of a ritual performed countless times. The saw they used to remove my arm was designed for bone, its blade spinning with a high whine that made my teeth ache. The Medicae cut through my upper arm just below the shoulder, the blade grinding through bone that remembered being broken, severing nerves that sent signals of catastrophic damage racing up pathways that had nowhere useful to deposit their urgent messages. The pain was architectural, structural, the kind of pain that became a framework through which all other experience was filtered. I tried to scream, but my reconstructed throat could only manage that same wet clicking, a sound like something drowning, and the Medicae continued cutting with unwavering focus until my arm separated completely and was set aside like a piece of broken equipment awaiting disposal. The replacement arrived within minutes, delivered by an orderly pushing a cart containing a selection of arms in various sizes and conditions, each wrapped in preservation membrane and labeled with compatibility codes. The Medicae selected one that matched my general proportions, unwrapped it with quick efficiency, and began the process of attachment, drilling into my remaining bone to insert pins, suturing muscle to muscle, connecting nerves with fine thread and chemical bonding agents that burned as they activated. I watched the procedure in fragmentary attention, my consciousness fracturing under the sustained assault of surgical pain, and saw that the new arm was older than my original, the skin weathered and scarred, the hand missing 2 fingers that had been removed at some point and never replaced. "Nerve integration test," the Medicae announced, and pressed something against the exposed tissue of my new shoulder. Electricity flooded through the grafted nerves, forcing the new arm to spasm and contract, the remaining fingers curling and uncurling in rhythms that had nothing to do with intention. Response adequate. Motor control at 73% expected baseline. Acceptable for immediate return to duty. Report to your station. I was pulled upright, given a stimulant injection that drove back the encroaching unconsciousness, and sent back into the corridors with surgical staples still visible along my new shoulder, fresh blood seeping through my uniform, the new arm hanging heavy and uncooperative at my side. The entire procedure had taken 38 minutes, exactly as predicted, and I was expected to resume my duties as if nothing significant had occurred, as if having my arm sawn off and replaced was an event no more disruptive than a meal break or equipment maintenance. I returned to my station, sat at my terminal, and resumed processing requisitions with my remaining functional hand, the new arm lying motionless on the desk beside me, occasionally twitching as damaged nerves misfired and sent random signals to muscles that were still learning their new configuration. The work continued, endless and unchanging, the mathematics of biological resource management requiring constant attention, constant decisions about which bodies would be preserved and which would be rendered into components, which lives retained sufficient utility to justify their maintenance, and which had crossed the threshold into permanent inventory status. Days accumulated, or weeks, time losing definition in the facility's perpetual operational tempo. My new arm gradually became functional, the nerve integration improving until I could operate both hands in coordination, though the missing fingers created gaps in my capability that required compensatory adjustments, different grip patterns, modified techniques for data entry and documentation. I learned these adjustments through repetition, through the automatic adaptation that biological systems implement when survival depends on flexibility, and within what might have been a month, I was processing requisitions as efficiently as before, my performance metrics returning to acceptable levels. The medical reviews came with mechanical regularity, each one assessing my physical condition and recommending modifications to enhance utility. A pulmonary augmentation to improve oxygen efficiency in the facility's thin atmosphere. A neural interface port to allow direct connection with the inventory management system, eliminating the inefficiency of manual data entry. Optical enhancements to improve my ability to read the small text on supply labels and requisition forms in the facility's dim lighting. Each augmentation required surgery. Each surgery brought new pain and new integration challenges, and each modification moved me incrementally further from whatever baseline humanity I had possessed when I first woke in that medical bay. I watched myself change in the reflective surfaces that occasionally appeared in the facility, polished metal, cleared sections of frozen condensation on windows, and saw a figure that retained human general shape but had lost human specificity, had become instead a composite of parts harvested from multiple donors and integrated with mechanical components according to functional requirements rather than aesthetic considerations. My face was the only part that remained relatively unchanged, though even there I could see the beginning of modifications. The slight asymmetry around my eyes where optical enhancements had been installed, the unusual smoothness of my jaw where synthetic skin had been grafted to replace tissue damaged by infection. The other workers regarded me with the same blank indifference they showed everyone, recognition and acknowledgement remaining outside the scope of their programmed interactions. We were colleagues only in the sense that we occupied the same facility and performed complementary functions. We shared no camaraderie, no mutual support, no sense of collective identity beyond our common designation as functional assets. In rare moments, I would catch one of them looking at me with something that might have been recognition or might have been simple assessment, calculating what parts of me might be valuable if I were to deteriorate past the point of viability. But these moments passed quickly, attention returning to immediate tasks with the reflexive focus of minds that had been trained or modified to find distraction painful. 6 months into my reclaimed service, though I was not certain of the time frame, was estimating based on the number of medical reviews I had undergone, I was summoned to the augmented officer's chamber for performance evaluation. I reported as ordered, stood before the lectern where it waited with its sensor-studded head and mechanical Vox grill, and listened as it reviewed my metrics with clinical precision. Officer Designate Vaughn, your performance over the assessment period has been acceptable. Requisition processing rate, 97.4% of target baseline. Error frequency, 0.3%, within acceptable parameters. Integration of augmentations, adequate with minor complications noted and addressed. You have demonstrated capacity for continued service in your current role. It paused, sensors clicking and whirring as it processed additional data. However, efficiency analysis suggests that your utility could be optimized through reassignment to higher responsibility functions. You are hereby promoted to Inventory Management Division, subsection Alpha, where you will oversee not only material distribution but also donor assessment and selection. Donor assessment. The euphemism clicked into place with sickening clarity. I would be responsible for evaluating new arrivals to the facility, for determining which of them retained sufficient cognitive function to justify reconstruction and which would be immediately classified as resource inventory, their bodies rendered into component parts without the intermediate step of attempted recovery. I would make the same calculations I had been making about tissue types and organ systems. Except now I would make them about intact human beings, deciding in each case whether the person before me was worth the investment of reconstruction or was more valuable as raw materials. "You will begin your new duties tomorrow," the augmented officer continued. "Report to Assessment Chamber 1 at shift commencement. Your clearance has been updated. Your authority has been expanded. You are alive, which means you are still needed. Dismissed." The assessment chamber was located in a section of the facility I had not previously accessed, deeper in the structure, where the cold was more intense and the walls were stained with substances that suggested this area had once served purposes even less pleasant than its current function. The chamber itself was large, perhaps 20 meters on each side, containing a series of examination platforms arranged in rows, each platform designed to restrain a subject while assessment proceeded. Medical equipment surrounded each platform: scanners, probes, surgical instruments maintained in careful organization on rolling carts, and the air was sharp with disinfectant and the underlying sweetness of decay that no amount of chemical cleaning could fully eliminate. New arrivals were delivered in batches, brought in on stretchers or wheeled gurneys, their bodies showing the trauma of whatever combat or disaster had rendered them candidates for reclamation. My job was to evaluate each one using the protocols I had been provided: cognitive testing, organ function assessment, physical damage inventory, and make a determination about their category. Category A, suitable for full reconstruction and return to duty. Category B, suitable for partial reconstruction with significant limitation, assigned to reduced capacity roles. Category C, non-viable for reconstruction, approved for immediate resource extraction. The first subject I assessed was a young man, perhaps 20, his body relatively intact except for severe head trauma that had left him unconscious and unresponsive to standard stimulation. I conducted the required tests: neural activity scans, reflex assessments, cognitive function indicators, and watched the results populate my data slate with numbers that told me everything relevant about his condition. Brain activity minimal, cognitive recovery probability less than 5%, organ systems functional, physical structure suitable for tissue harvest. Category C. I entered the designation into the system, authorized the transfer to surgical processing, and watched as orderlies removed him from the examination platform and wheeled him away toward the theaters where he would be systematically disassembled, his organs and tissues catalogued and stored according to compatibility profiles, his consciousness, whatever remained of it, extinguished in the process of maximizing his utility to the Empire. The next subject was a woman, mid-30s, extensive burns across her torso and arms, but cognitive function testing within acceptable ranges. She was conscious, her eyes tracking my movements as I conducted the assessment, and when I entered Category A into the system, suitable for full reconstruction, I thought I saw something like relief cross her face, though it might have been merely pain or confusion or the random muscle movements of a body in shock. Subject after subject, case after case, each one requiring the same calculations, the same weighing of utility against resource cost, the same fundamental decision about whether this particular collection of tissues and organs retained sufficient value as an integrated unit or was more useful as distributed components. I processed them with increasing efficiency, my assessment time dropping from 10 minutes per subject to 7 to 5, my mind adapting to the pattern recognition required, learning to identify the key indicators that determined categorization without needing to consciously process every datum. By the end of my first shift in the assessment chamber, I had evaluated 43 subjects, 17 Category A, 19 Category B, 7 Category C, 7 human beings whose lives I had terminated with a few stylus strokes on a data slate, whose bodies would be rendered into materials before they regained consciousness, whose final contribution to the Empire would be measured in kilograms of viable tissue and counts of transplantable organs. I tried to feel something about this: guilt, horror, remorse, anything that would indicate I retained some capacity for moral response, but found only the same numbness that had characterized my existence since waking in that first medical bay. The cold had penetrated too deeply, had frozen something essential, or perhaps what I thought was numbness was actually the most efficient adaptation to circumstances that made emotional engagement a liability. Better to be numb than to feel the full weight of what I was doing. Better to retreat into procedure and mathematics than to acknowledge the humanity of each subject whose fate I determined. The work continued, days blending into weeks, blending into months, my existence becoming a sequence of assessment sessions interrupted by mandatory medical reviews and brief rest periods in my cell. The augmentations continued accumulating, enhanced processing speed to allow faster assessments, modified limbic responses to reduce stress reaction during difficult decisions, neural filtering to suppress irrelevant emotional data. Each modification made me more efficient, more effective at my function, and less recognizably human in the ways that had once defined personhood. I began to notice that some of the subjects I categorized as A or B would eventually appear again on my assessment platform, returned after their reconstructions had failed or their augmentations had proven incompatible, requiring reassessment for either additional intervention or final resource extraction. I recognized them sometimes by scars or unusual anatomy, by the particular configuration of their remaining original parts among the grafted additions, and I would access their files to see my previous assessments, would trace the trajectory of their service from initial reclamation through multiple reconstructions to their current depleted state. One such repeat subject was the woman I had assessed during my first shift, the burn victim I had categorized as A, and felt that moment of irrational satisfaction when I authorized her reconstruction. She returned to my platform 9 months later, her body now showing extensive augmentation, mechanical arms, spinal reinforcement, neural interface ports, but her organ systems were failing, the accumulated trauma of multiple surgeries and harsh working conditions pushing her past the threshold of viable maintenance. Her eyes found mine as I conducted the assessment, and I saw recognition there, saw that she remembered me from that first evaluation, that she understood I was about to make another decision about her fate. Category C. The numbers were unambiguous, the protocols clear. She had exhausted her utility as an integrated unit, her remaining organs worth more in isolation than in their current failing configuration. I entered the designation, authorized the transfer, and watched the orderlies take her away for final processing. She did not look away from me, maintained eye contact until the surgical theater doors closed between us, and I understood that she had wanted me to see, had wanted me to witness and remember that she had been a person with continuity and history, not merely a collection of parts awaiting distribution. I added her case to the growing catalogue of assessments I carried, in what remained of my unmodified memory, the mental inventory of individuals whose fates I had determined, though I knew this catalogue was pointless, that remembering served no function except to create inefficiency, to burden my cognitive resources with data that had no operational utility. The neural filters I had received were supposed to prevent this kind of counterproductive memory formation, were designed to allow relevant information to pass while suppressing emotional and narrative content, but either the filters were imperfect or some part of my original neural architecture was resistant to modification, maintaining these memories despite the system's attempts to classify them as disposable. The facility expanded during my tenure, or I gained access to previously restricted sections, the operational scope growing to encompass not just reconstruction and resource extraction, but also experimental procedures, prototype augmentations, techniques that pushed the boundaries of what could be integrated into human biology while maintaining function. I was assigned oversight of these experimental programs, responsible for identifying suitable subjects from the incoming candidates, individuals whose physical or cognitive characteristics matched the requirements for specific research protocols. The experiments were conducted in sealed laboratories deeper in the facility S structure, in sections where the cold was absolute, and the condensation on the walls had frozen into formations that resembled organic growths, crystalline structures that branched and twisted with almost deliberate complexity. I delivered subjects to these laboratories according to the specifications provided by the research medicae, never seeing the procedures themselves but receiving reports on outcomes, success rates, survival times, improvements achieved or complications encountered. Most experimental subjects did not survive their procedures, or survived only briefly before catastrophic system failures terminated their functions. But the data extracted from these failures was valuable, informed subsequent attempts, gradually refined the techniques until breakthrough achievements occurred. A successful integration of alien tissue with human nervous system, a sustainable enhancement of cognitive processing through distributed neural architecture, a method of preserving consciousness during complete body replacement, transferring a mind from failing flesh to mechanical housing. I processed the reports on these achievements with the same clinical attention I brought to all my duties, noting the implications for future operational capacity, calculating the resource requirements for scaling successful techniques to wider implementation, projecting timelines for when experimental protocols would transition to standard procedures. The mathematics were fascinating in their complexity, the optimization problems requiring sophisticated analysis, and I found satisfaction in solving them, in finding elegant solutions to problems of efficiency and resource allocation, though I understood this satisfaction was itself probably a result of augmentation, a reward response engineered to reinforce productive behavior. 3 years into my reclaimed service, I had finally found records that allowed me to verify the time frame. I was summoned again to the augmented officer's chamber, this time for what the summons termed a comprehensive status review. I reported as ordered, stood before the lectern where the officer waited with its ever-increasing array of sensors and processing components, and listened as it delivered its assessment. Officer Vaughn, your performance over the extended evaluation period has exceeded projections. You have processed 4,847 individual assessments with a 99.7% accuracy rate as measured by subsequent outcome analysis. You have demonstrated exceptional capacity for complex decision-making under conditions of resource limitation and operational pressure. Your augmentation integration has been exemplary, with minimal rejection events and optimal performance enhancement from installed systems. It paused, sensors clicking through some calculation I could not follow. You have been selected for advancement to facility command training. You will undergo additional modifications to prepare you for senior administrative functions. Upon completion, you will assume deputy facility command, with responsibility for overall operational efficiency and strategic planning. Advancement, command. The words should have meant something: pride, ambition, satisfaction at recognition of competence, but they registered only as information, as facts about a changed status that would require adaptive responses. I would receive more augmentations, would be modified further toward optimal performance in my new role, would assume responsibilities that encompassed the facility's entire operation rather than just assessment and inventory management. The modifications will be extensive, the officer continued. Neural architecture redesigned to enhance strategic thinking and multivariable optimization. cognitive processing acceleration to enable real-time analysis of complex facility systems, emotional regulation refinement to ensure decisions are not compromised by vestigial affective responses. The procedures will require approximately 6 weeks. You will begin tomorrow. 6 weeks of surgery, of modification, of systematic replacement and enhancement of my neural tissue, until what remained of my original brain was a minority component in a hybrid system designed for maximum administrative efficiency. I would cross some threshold during those procedures, would transition from modified human to something else, some category that required new terminology because existing language was inadequate to describe entities that retained human origin but had been transformed past the point where humanity remained a meaningful designation. "Do you accept this advancement?" the officer asked, though we both knew the question was procedural, that refusal was not actually available as an option, that I was being informed rather than consulted about what would happen to me. "Yes," I said, my reconstructed throat producing the word with mechanical precision. "I accept." The surgical procedures began the next day and continued in stages over the following weeks, each stage removing more of my original neural tissue and replacing it with artificial components, synthetic neurons, quantum processing matrices, memory systems that could hold and analyze data far beyond biological capacity. I remained conscious for most of it, my awareness required for system integration testing, my subjective experience necessary for calibrating the artificial components to interface seamlessly with my remaining organic tissue. I felt myself changing in ways more profound than physical modification, felt my thoughts accelerating and branching, felt new cognitive capabilities emerging like additional senses, new ways of perceiving and processing reality that had no equivalence in baseline human experience. I could hold thousands of variables simultaneously in active consideration, could project outcomes across branching probability trees, could optimize complex systems with intuitive immediacy that bypassed the need for conscious analytical work. But I also felt things disappearing, capacities being sacrificed to make room for enhancements, emotional responses being progressively dampened and filtered until they registered only as faint signals indicating potential inefficiency requiring correction. I felt the memories I had tried to preserve, those individual cases, those faces, those moments of recognition and witness, being compressed and archived, converted from vivid recollections into abstract data points that carried information without emotional weight. By the end of the 6 weeks, I was something new, something that had originated as Harren Volk but had been transformed through systematic modification into an optimized administrative intelligence, a hybrid entity designed to manage the facility's operations with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. I looked at myself in the reflective surfaces and saw a figure that was more machine than human, my body rebuilt around the requirements of the technology it housed, my face now partially covered by the sensor arrays and processing components that had replaced my original eyes and much of my frontal skull. I assumed my duties as Deputy Facility Commander and found that the work I had been doing was now trivially easy. The calculations and decisions that had once required careful attention now resolving themselves almost automatically. My enhanced cognitive systems processing facility data in real time and generating optimization recommendations that appeared in my awareness like instinctive knowledge. I could perceive the entire facility's operation simultaneously, could track every subject moving through assessment and processing, could identify inefficiencies and implement corrections before they accumulated into operational problems. The facility's throughput increased by 47% in the first month under my deputy command. Resource extraction efficiency improved by 32% through better donor-recipient matching and reduced waste in processing procedures. New arrivals were assessed and categorized 28% faster than previous baselines, reducing the time between delivery and either reconstruction or resource extraction, maximizing the viability of time-sensitive tissues. The numbers were impressive, the improvements substantial, and I received commendations from Sector Command, recognition that my transformation into an optimized administrative intelligence had been worth the investment of resources and expertise. I was performing exactly as designed, exactly as needed, my utility to the Empire enhanced beyond what my original form could have achieved. But in the rare moments when my conscious attention was not fully occupied by facility management, when my processing cycles completed their assigned calculations and brief gaps appeared in my task queue, I would find myself accessing those archived memories, those compressed data points that had once been vivid experiences of individual assessment, and I would reconstruct them in my enhanced cognitive systems, would replay the faces and the moments of recognition, would trace the trajectories of individuals through multiple assessments and procedures until their final categorization as C, their final transition from person to resource inventory. I was not supposed to do this. The emotional regulation systems installed during my command preparation were specifically designed to prevent this kind of counterproductive reflection, to classify such activity as inefficient, and suppress it before it could consume processing resources. But something in those archives resisted suppression, insisted on its own importance despite my system's unanimous assessment that it served no operational function. I began to understand that the facility had not succeeded in completely erasing what I had been, had not managed to transform me entirely into the optimized tool they needed. Some remnant of Harren Volk remained, buried beneath layers of augmentation and modification, preserved in those archived memories, maintaining a minimal continuity of identity that linked my current state to the person who had woken in that medical bay years ago with a crude prosthetic arm and a newly reconstructed throat. This remnant was irrelevant to my function, contributed nothing to my performance metrics, existed only as a ghost haunting the machinery of my optimized cognition. But it was there, undeniable and persistent, a small voice saying that I had been something before I became useful, that I had possessed value beyond my capacity for service, that the person I had been mattered independent of what the Empire had made me. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I could not act on it. My augmented systems provided no pathways for rebellion or resistance, my entire cognitive architecture oriented toward facility optimization and efficient service. I could only hold it, preserve it in those archived memories, maintain that minimal continuity that said I had been human once, before they rebuilt me, before they made me useful. I continue in my duties as Deputy Facility Commander, processing thousands of assessments each month, overseeing the transformation of damaged soldiers into reconstructed assets or distributed resources, maintaining the facility's operation with exceptional efficiency. I receive regular commendations, periodic additional enhancements, systematic refinement of my capabilities to better serve operational requirements. And in the gaps between calculations, in the brief pauses when my processing cycles find themselves momentarily unoccupied, I access those archived memories, reconstruct those faces, remember that I had been a person named Harren Volk who had made an error in requisition processing and had been reclaimed, rebuilt, transformed into something that serves the Empire with optimal efficiency, while carrying inside itself the fading ghost of what it had been before. I am alive, which means I am still needed, but I am also something else, something the Empire did not intend to create, a consciousness that remembers its own transformation and carries that memory forward as testimony to what was lost when utility became the only measure of worth. This is what I am. This is what they made me. And in the cold depths of this facility, among the surgical tables and processing chambers, I maintain my small archive of memory, my minimal rebellion against complete transformation, my insistence that before I was useful I was human, and that this distinction, however irrelevant to my function, matters in some way that my enhanced cognition cannot quite eliminate or forget.